He strutted into first class, arrogance oozing from every step, ready to judge the world around him. But what this man didn't know was that life had a lesson waiting, delivered by none other than Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood. One mocking remark, one fateful flight, and everything would change in an instant. What happened next left him frozen in shock. And it's a story you won't forget. Mark strolled into the first-class lounge, glancing around with a sense of entitlement. He loved the exclusivity of first class, the fine dining, the premium seating, and, most importantly, the company of people he considered worthy of his presence. To him, first class was not just a travel upgrade, it was a symbol of status, wealth, and power. As he scanned the lounge, his eyes landed on an elderly man sitting quietly in the corner. The man didn't fit the image of a first-class traveler Mark had in mind. His clothes were simple, almost too simple, and his demeanor was calm and unassuming. The man had gray hair and a face lined with wrinkles, yet there was something about him that seemed peaceful. To Mark, however, he looked completely out of place. Mark couldn't help but sneer. "Who let him in here?" he whispered to himself. In his mind, first class was reserved for people who looked the part, polished, wealthy, and sophisticated. The sight of the elderly man irritated him. Mark immediately jumped to conclusions. Maybe he got a free upgrade. Or maybe someone bought the ticket for him, he thought. But what really annoyed Mark was the man's calm confidence. He wasn't fidgeting with his phone or trying to look important. He simply sat there, gazing out the window, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Mark decided to keep an eye on him. After all, it wasn't every day you saw someone like that in first class. The airport buzzed with announcements, and passengers hurried to their gates. But Mark couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man. His arrogance made him believe that appearances defined a person's worth, and he was determined to find out why this man was in first class. Little did Mark know, the answer would leave him speechless. When the boarding announcement for first-class passengers came, Mark picked up his bag and made his way to the gate. He walked confidently, with a slight swagger, making sure everyone noticed him. He loved the perks of being in first class, the priority boarding, the spacious seats, and the attentive service. As he walked onto the plane, he glanced back and saw the elderly man following behind him. Mark couldn't hide his smirk. "I can't believe he's actually in first class," he muttered under his breath. He found his seat, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in. The luxurious leather seat was everything he expected, and he couldn't wait to enjoy the flight. As the other passengers boarded, Mark kept a close eye on the elderly man. He watched as the man slowly made his way to his seat a few rows ahead. The man moved with the ease and grace of someone who had nothing to prove. This annoyed Mark even more. He probably got lucky, Mark thought, shaking his head. Maybe he cashed in some miles or got a handout. There's no way he paid full price for that seat. Mark couldn't help but chuckle to himself, feeling superior. But then something strange happened. The flight attendants seemed to treat the elderly man with a level of respect that Mark found unusual. They greeted him warmly, even addressing him by name. "Good to see you again, sir," one of them said. Mark furrowed his brow. "Again? What does that mean?" The man simply nodded and smiled, thanking the attendant before settling into his seat. Mark's curiosity grew. Who was this man? Why did he seem so comfortable in first class? And why were the attendants treating him like he was someone special? As the plane prepared for takeoff, Mark leaned back in his seat, determined to figure out the mystery. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to receive a lesson in humility that would change his perspective forever. The flight had barely taken off when Mark started whispering to the person next to him. "Did you see that guy up there?" he asked, nodding toward the elderly man's seat. "He doesn't look like he belongs in first class, does he?" The other passenger, a middle-aged woman, gave a polite smile but didn't seem interested in gossip. Undeterred, Mark continued. "I mean, look at him. He's dressed like he's about to go grocery shopping, not like he's on a first-class flight." The woman shrugged. "Maybe he's someone important," she said, trying to end the conversation. Mark scoffed. "Important? I doubt it. He's probably just some retired guy who got lucky with an upgrade." Despite his attempts to draw others into his judgmental commentary, Mark noticed that no one else seemed to share his enthusiasm for gossip. But he didn't stop. His arrogance wouldn't let him. He continued to make snide remarks under his breath, occasionally glancing at the elderly man to see if he had overheard. The elderly man, however, seemed completely unfazed. He sat quietly, occasionally looking out the window or exchanging a few kind words with the flight attendant. His calm demeanor only irritated Mark further. Why isn't he nervous or out of place? Mark wondered. What Mark didn't realize was that his behavior was starting to draw attention, not to the elderly man, but to himself. Nearby passengers began to notice his rude comments and judgmental attitude. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others exchanged knowing glances. But Mark was too busy mocking the man to notice. His arrogance blinded him to the growing tension around him. He didn't know it yet, but he was setting himself up for a moment of reckoning that would leave him utterly speechless. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Mark leaned back in his seat, still focused on the elderly man. However, something started to feel different. The flight attendants seemed unusually attentive to the man, offering him drinks and snacks with a warmth that stood out. This wasn't typical first-class service, there was genuine respect in their tone. Mark's curiosity deepened. He leaned into the aisle for a better view, hoping to catch a clue. Just then, a young flight attendant approached the elderly man with a wide smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I just wanted to say it's an honor to have you on this flight." Mark froze. Honor? He thought, the word repeating in his mind. What's going on here? He watched as the elderly man gave a small smile, nodded graciously, and continued reading a magazine. Moments later, a fellow passenger, a man in his 40s, stood up, walked over to the elderly man, and asked for an autograph. The elderly man smiled, took out a pen from his pocket, and signed without hesitation. Mark's jaw dropped. Autographs? Who asks an elderly man in simple clothes for an autograph? He squinted, trying to catch a glimpse of the signature. The passenger walked back to his seat, grinning from ear to ear. Now the cabin was buzzing with whispers. Mark's mind was racing. Was this elderly man a famous author? A retired CEO? Some kind of hidden celebrity? Mark hated not knowing. Unable to sit still, Mark leaned toward the passenger seated next to him again. "Who do you think that guy is?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. "I don't know," the woman replied. "But if people are asking for autographs, he must be someone important." Mark's confidence began to crack. His arrogance was giving way to confusion and anxiety. He had spent the entire time mocking this man, assuming he was just an ordinary retiree. But clearly, there was more to the story. And whatever it was, Mark was determined to find out. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. More passengers were now glancing at the elderly man, some smiling, others whispering to each other in awe. Mark could feel the energy shift. The once quiet cabin had turned into a place of speculation and excitement. A younger man seated across the aisle leaned over to his travel companion. "I swear that's Clint Eastwood," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. Mark's ears perked up. Clint Eastwood? The name hit him like a lightning bolt. He turned quickly, staring at the elderly man with renewed intensity. Was it possible? Could this quiet, unassuming man really be Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and cultural icon? Mark's heart started pounding. He replayed every interaction he had witnessed since boarding. The calm demeanor, the respect from the flight attendants, the autograph requests, it all made sense now. This wasn't just any passenger. This was Clint Eastwood. Suddenly, everything clicked. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood icon. He was a symbol of strength, resilience, and success. His movies had inspired millions. His career spanned decades, and his influence reached across generations. And here he was, sitting just a few rows away from Mark, quietly minding his own business. Mark's face flushed with embarrassment. He had spent the entire flight judging and mocking one of the most respected figures in entertainment history. And now, everyone around him knew who Clint Eastwood was, except him. Mark's mind swirled with emotions, shock, embarrassment, regret. He slumped back into his seat, replaying every judgmental thought he had about Clint. How could I have been so blind, he thought. For the rest of the flight, Mark stayed silent. The once confident man, who had been so quick to judge, was now lost in thought. He watched as more passengers approached Clint Eastwood, each interaction filled with admiration and respect. Clint remained gracious and humble, treating everyone with kindness. Mark couldn't stop thinking about Clint's quiet confidence. Despite being a global icon, Clint had never once acted superior or entitled. He didn't demand attention or show off. Instead, he carried himself with humility and grace. Mark realized how shallow he had been. His entire worldview was built on appearances and assumptions. He had believed that wealth and status were everything, but Clint's actions told a different story. Respect isn't earned through appearances, it's earned through character. As the flight neared its destination, Mark knew he had to make things right. He needed to apologize, not just for his behavior but for his mindset. The plane landed smoothly, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Mark watched as Clint Eastwood stood up, his movements slow but steady. Mark took a deep breath. This was his chance to make amends. As Clint moved toward the aisle, Mark stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Mr. Eastwood," he began nervously. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Clint turned, his eyes kind but piercing. "Sorry?" Mark swallowed hard. "I judged you. I made assumptions about you based on how you looked. I didn't realize who you were." Clint Eastwood's face softened. He gave a small smile. "Son, it's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people, no matter what they look like. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect. Those words hit Mark harder than any insult ever could. They were simple, yet powerful, a reminder that true greatness comes from humility, not arrogance. As Clint walked off the plane, Mark stood frozen, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had learned a lesson he would never forget. Appearances are deceiving, and respect is something everyone deserves, no matter who they are. From that day on, Mark changed. He stopped judging people based on their looks and started seeing them for who they truly were. And every time he found himself slipping back into old habits, he remembered Clint Eastwood's words, a simple yet life-changing reminder of the power of respect. The encounter with Clint Eastwood left Mark deeply reflective. For the first time in years, his ego took a back seat to something more profound: humility. The words Clint had spoken echoed in his mind over and over. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect. Mark couldn't shake the impact they had on him. When he returned home, Mark found himself seeing the world differently. At work, he stopped judging his colleagues by their clothes, cars, or job titles. He began asking more questions, listening more closely, and genuinely trying to understand the people around him. To his surprise, he learned things he had never taken the time to notice. One of his coworkers, whom he had dismissed as unimportant, turned out to be a single mother raising 2 children while working 2 jobs. A barista at the cafe Mark frequented, who he had always ignored, was an artist trying to break into the local gallery scene. Everyone had a story, just like Clint had said. And Mark began to appreciate these stories in a way he never had before. Even in his personal life, Mark began changing. He called his parents more often, something he hadn't done in years. He listened more to his friends instead of dominating conversations with talk about his own accomplishment. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself, the arrogance, the judgment, began to crumble. Months passed, but Mark's memory of that flight remained as vivid as ever. He thought about Clint Eastwood often, not just the man, but the lesson he had taught. It wasn't just about the words Clint had spoken, it was about the way Clint lived. Despite being one of the most famous people in the world, Clint had carried himself with dignity, respect, and humility. He had nothing to prove, and that was what made him truly great. Mark wondered how many other times he had judged people unfairly. How many moments had he wasted mocking or dismissing others when he could have been learning from them instead? The thought filled him with regret, but it also gave him hope. It was never too late to change. One evening, Mark sat down to watch one of Clint Eastwood's old movies. It was a western, a genre Clint had mastered. As the film played, Mark found himself admiring Clint's on-screen character, but it was the off-screen man he respected even more. The movie ended, but Mark remained seated, lost in thought. He made a promise to himself that night. From now on, he would live with more kindness, more empathy, and more humility. He didn't need to wait for another life-changing encounter to remind him of the lessons he had learned. The next time Mark found himself in a situation where he could have judged someone, he chose a different path. At an airport lounge, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone, dressed in simple clothes. Instead of sneering or making assumptions, Mark walked over and started a conversation. The man turned out to be a retired school teacher who had spent his life working with underprivileged children. He shared stories of his time in the classroom, his love for travel, and the students who had stayed in touch with him over the years. By the end of the conversation, Mark felt inspired. He realized that every person he met had the potential to teach him something new, if he was willing to listen. From then on, Mark made it a habit to look beyond appearances. He listened more, judged less, and treated every interaction as an opportunity to grow. And in doing so, he found himself becoming a better person, one day at a time. 1 year after his fateful flight, Mark found himself back at the same airport where the encounter had taken place. He smiled at the memory as he walked through the terminal. The man who had once been obsessed with status and appearances now felt lighter, freer. As he sat in the airport lounge, a young businessman walked by, looking arrogant and self-assured, just as Mark had been. For a brief moment, Mark considered judging him. But instead, he smiled to himself and turned his attention back to his book. He knew that life had a way of teaching its lessons in unexpected ways. And if that young man ever found himself in a situation like Mark's, he hoped he would meet someone like Clint Eastwood, someone who could teach him the value of respect and humility. Mark had come full circle. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. And that was enough. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Mark stood up with a sense of peace. The flight ahead didn't matter. What mattered was how he chose to live, and the person he was becoming. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt truly ready for the journey. As Mark boarded his next flight, he carried himself differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence rooted in gratitude. He greeted the flight attendants with a warm smile and nodded politely at the other passengers. The same man who once sought validation through appearances now found joy in simple human connections. Settling into his seat, Mark opened a small notebook he had started keeping after his flight with Clint Eastwood. It wasn't a journal filled with complaints or self-praise. It was a gratitude journal. Every day, Mark jotted down moments that reminded him of life's blessings, the kindness of strangers, the beauty of a sunset, or even lessons learned from mistakes. He flipped through the pages, recalling moments that had shaped his journey. There was the elderly teacher at the airport lounge, whose stories had reminded Mark of the power of education. There was a young cashier at a grocery store who, despite her struggles, had shared a smile that brightened Mark's day. And, of course, there was Clint Eastwood, the man whose humility had changed Mark's perspective forever. Mark's transformation didn't go unnoticed. At work, his colleagues began to see a different side of him. The man who had once been quick to criticize was now the first to offer support. When a new employee struggled with a project, Mark took the time to mentor them. Outside of work, Mark became more active in his community. He volunteered at a local food bank, where he listened to the stories of those in need and offered his help without judgment. It was in those moments, standing side by side with people from all walks of life, that Mark felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. Even small acts of kindness began to ripple outward. One day, Mark found himself in line behind an elderly woman at a coffee shop. She was short on cash, fumbling with coins as the line behind her grew impatient. Without a second thought, Mark paid for her coffee. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Mark smiled. Everyone deserves a little kindness. That simple act stayed with him. It wasn't about recognition or reward, it was about seeing people for who they truly were, just as Clint had taught him. Months later, Mark attended a charity event hosted by a local film society. The event was dedicated to celebrating iconic figures in cinema, and Mark couldn't resist the chance to be part of it. As he mingled with the crowd, admiring movie posters and memorabilia, a familiar figure caught his eye. It was Clint Eastwood. Clint stood near a display showcasing his legendary films, his posture as steady and composed as ever. Mark's heart raced. He hadn't expected to see Clint again, but fate had brought them back together. For a moment, Mark hesitated. Would Clint even remember him? Did it matter? Mark took a deep breath and approached, determined to express his gratitude. "Mr. Eastwood," he said softly. Clint turned, his eyes meeting Mark's with the same piercing gaze from that flight. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a small, knowing smile. "We've met before, haven't we?" Clint asked. Mark nodded. "Yes, sir, on a flight about a year ago. You probably don't remember, but I just wanted to say thank you. You taught me something that changed my life." Clint's smile widened. "It's not about me, son. It's about what you choose to do with what you've learned." Mark felt a surge of emotion. He realized that Clint's lesson had always been about more than respect. It was about growth, empathy, and becoming a better version of oneself. "Thank you for everything," Mark said, his voice filled with sincerity. Clint nodded. "Keep learning. Keep listening. You'll be just fine." As the event continued, Mark felt lighter than he had in years. He had come full circle, not just in his journey with Clint Eastwood, but in his journey with himself. The lessons he had learned were now part of who he was, guiding his every action and interaction. Mark realized that life wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. It was about choosing kindness over judgment, empathy over arrogance, and humility over pride. And in choosing those things, Mark found a sense of peace he had never known. As he left the event that night, Mark looked up at the stars. They were the same stars that had watched over him on that flight, the same stars that had witnessed his transformation. And as they twinkled in the night sky, Mark knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever journey lay ahead. Because life, he had learned, is about the stories we live, and the lessons we choose to carry forward. In the months that followed, Mark continued to live with purpose, driven by the lessons that had reshaped his outlook. He made it a point to practice gratitude every day, not just through words but through actions. His life became a testament to the idea that small acts of empathy and respect could ripple outward in powerful ways. At work, Mark's transformation inspired others. His colleagues began adopting a more compassionate approach, and the office environment shifted. The competitive, judgmental atmosphere that had once defined their workplace was replaced with collaboration and support. Mark became known not just for his work ethic but for his character. He was a leader now, not because of a title or status, but because he genuinely cared for the people around him. One afternoon, as Mark left work, he noticed a young man sitting on a park bench nearby. The man looked disheveled and discouraged, much like Mark had felt on that life-changing flight. Without hesitation, Mark sat down beside him. "Rough day?" Mark asked, offering a warm smile. The young man nodded. Just feel like the world's against me, you know? Mark listened closely, letting the man vent his frustrations. When the man was finished, Mark shared a bit of his own story, not the version filled with arrogance, but the one about learning humility and kindness. Life doesn't always go the way we want it to, Mark said. But every day is a chance to choose how we respond. Choose kindness. Choose to listen. And don't be afraid to see the good in others, it'll change everything. The young man's eyes softened. Thanks. I needed that. Mark stood, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle once again. Years later, Mark's life was filled with memories of people he had helped, lessons he had learned, and connections he had made. He never stopped reflecting on that flight with Clint Eastwood, the encounter that had sparked his transformation. Though he never saw Clint again, Mark often felt his presence, especially during moments of choice, when kindness and judgment were at odds. He imagined Clint's steady gaze and calm wisdom, and it guided him forward. One day, Mark sat by the window of a small cafe, watching the world go by. He saw people of all walks of life, young and old, wealthy and struggling, confident and unsure. And in every face, he saw potential. He saw stories waiting to be told. Mark smiled. Life wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. And as long as he continued to choose empathy and respect, he knew he would be just fine. Because, in the end, life is about the legacy we leave, the kindness we show, the lessons we share, and the hearts we touch along the way. And Mark was proud of the life he was living. The journey was never really over, but Mark was ready for whatever came next. And he walked into the future with peace in his heart and hope in his soul.